The jungle never sleeps. It breathes. It watches. And in Vietnam, it listened. This is a story about sound, about silence, about two allied armies fighting the same war in the same jungle, but moving through it in completely different ways. One could be heard, the other could not. And that difference saved lives, won firefights, and created a legend that still echoes today among those who served. This is the story of why the Viet Cong could hear the Americans coming, but almost never the Australians. In the dense, triple canopy jungle of Vietnam, sound traveled in strange ways. It bent around trees, absorbed into wet foliage, echoed off hidden rocks, and carried further than it should. A careless footstep could be heard 50 meters away. A voice, even whispered, could carry twice that distance in the right conditions. The clink of a canteen against a magazine pouch might as well have been a dinner bell. The jungle amplified everything and forgave nothing. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army, listening was survival. They knew the jungle intimately. They understood its rhythms, its sounds, its silence. They knew what belonged and what didn't. A bird going quiet, a monkey's warning call, the unnatural snap of a branch under a boot that shouldn't be there. And they listened constantly. VC scouts were trained from the beginning to use their ears as much as their eyes. In thick vegetation, where visibility dropped to mere meters, sound became the primary sense. They learned to distinguish between the rustle of wind through bamboo and the rustle of a man pushing through it. They learned the metallic signature of different weapons, the clack of an M16 bolt versus the heavier chunk of an SLR. They learned to count enemy soldiers by the rhythm of footsteps, to judge distance by the clarity of sound, to predict movement by the pattern of noise. The Americans and Australians knew this. Every soldier who stepped off a Hercules into the humidity of Vietnam learned quickly, the jungle has ears. Make noise, and you die. It's that simple. But knowing it and living it were two different things. Silence wasn't a tactical preference in Vietnam. It wasn't about being sneaky or clever. It was about survival. Because the side that heard the other first usually won. The side that moved without sound controlled the engagement. The side that could get close without being detected had the advantage of surprise, the luxury of choice ambush, observe, or withdraw. American doctrine understood this. Australian doctrine understood this. Both armies trained their men in patrol craft and noise discipline. Both emphasized the importance of moving quietly. Both knew that sound could kill you faster than a bullet. But in practice, in the actual mud and blood reality of patrolling through hostile jungle, there was a difference, a significant one, and the enemy noticed. Viet Cong after-action reports, prisoner interrogations, and first-hand accounts all point to the same observation. American patrols could be heard. Australian patrols could not. It wasn't always true, wasn't universal, but it was common enough to be tactically relevant. Common enough that VC fighters in Phuoc Tuy province, where the Australians operated, learned to fear the silence as much as the contact. The Australians, one captured VC soldier said in 1968, "We could not hear them. They appeared from nowhere." Another described them as more frightening than the Americans because we never knew they were there until they wanted us to know. These weren't compliments. They were tactical assessments, the kind of professional evaluation that soldiers make about their enemies when their lives depend on getting it right. So what made the difference? Why could the VC hear one Allied army, but not the other? Was it training? Equipment? Size? Doctrine? Culture? The answer is all of it. And the story of how those differences developed, how they played out in the jungle, and what they meant for the men who fought there is deeper and more fascinating than simple myth or national pride. It's a story about two different military traditions meeting the same enemy in the same place and discovering that the small things, the quiet things, mattered more than anyone expected. Let's be clear from the start. American soldiers were not careless. They were not undisciplined. They were not ignorant of noise discipline or patrol craft. The United States Army and Marine Corps that fought in Vietnam were professional forces with good training and experienced leadership. They understood infantry tactics. They knew how to patrol. They knew silence mattered. But they were built for a different kind of war. The American way of war emphasized overwhelming force, superior firepower, and technological advantage. When the U.S. military went somewhere, it went in strength. Battalions, companies, platoons that looked like small armies to everyone else. This philosophy carried over to Vietnam, even though Vietnam was a different war entirely. American patrols in Vietnam were typically large. A standard patrol might be 20 to 30 men, sometimes more. The thinking was sound. More men meant more firepower, more security, more ability to handle contact. If you ran into trouble, you had the numbers to fight your way out. You had enough people to secure a landing zone for medevac. You had redundancy. But more men meant more noise. 30 soldiers moving through jungle make 30 times the sound of one soldier, but exponentially more because they have to coordinate, communicate, maintain formation. Every additional man is another pair of boots, another set of webbing, another canteen, another rifle, another human being who might cough, stumble, or bump into something. American soldiers also carried more equipment, a lot more. The U.S. military had the logistics to support it, so they used it. American grunts humped enormous loads, 60, 70, sometimes 80 pounds of gear, ammunition, water, rations, extra batteries for radios, claymore mines, grenades, M60 machine gun ammo, mortar rounds, medical supplies, entrenching tools. The list went on. All of that weight meant more things to bang together. More metal on metal, more straps to loosen and rattle, more mass shifting with each step, making balance harder and movement noisier. The equipment itself was often noisy by design. American webbing systems used metal clips and D-rings. Canteens were metal. Ammo pouches had metal snaps. The M16 rifle had a distinctive sound. The rattle of the charging handle, the click of the safety, the metallic ping of magazines being changed. Even the boots, the standard-issue jungle boots, with their reinforced toes and metal shanks, made a particular sound on hard ground. None of this was incompetence. It was optimization for a different set of priorities. American gear was designed to be durable, reliable, and functional under a massive variety of conditions. It was designed to be produced by the millions and shipped around the world. It was designed to keep soldiers alive and effective. Silence was a consideration, but not the primary one. American patrol doctrine also emphasized communication. Radios were standard. Regular check-ins with base were mandatory. Artillery support was always on call, which meant forward observers needed to talk to fire direction centers. Helicopter support meant coordination with pilots. All of this meant more radio traffic, more squelch breaks, more whispered conversations into handsets. And American patrols moved differently, faster in many cases. The emphasis was on covering ground, patrolling sectors, showing presence, making contact. There was a tempo to American operations that reflected industrial warfare. Thinking, maintain pressure, keep moving, stay aggressive. This wasn't wrong. It achieved objectives. But it was louder. There was also the simple reality of culture and training. Most American soldiers came from urban or suburban backgrounds. They grew up on pavement and in buildings. They learned to hunt, if they hunted at all. in managed forests with marked trails. The idea of moving silently through dense vegetation wasn't instinctive. It had to be taught, and in the abbreviated training cycles of Vietnam-era conscription, there was only so much time to teach it. American soldiers learned noise discipline, but they learned it in the context of everything else they had, to learn how to use their weapons, how to call for artillery, how to treat wounds, how to survive booby traps, how to read maps, how to operate radios. Silence was one skill among dozens. The result was that American patrols, despite their best efforts and genuine professionalism, made noise. Not always, not everywhere. There were American units, particularly Special Forces, LRRPs, and Marine Recon teams that moved with exceptional stealth. But the average infantry patrol, the backbone of the American effort in Vietnam, could be heard. The VC knew it. They planned around it. They set ambushes along likely patrol routes and listened for the Americans to walk into them. They tracked American movements by sound and avoided contact when they wanted to. They used the noise to their advantage, and it cost American lives. This wasn't a failure of courage or competence. American soldiers fought with incredible bravery in Vietnam, but the institutional factors, the size of patrols, the weight of gear, the design of equipment, the cultural background of soldiers, the doctrine that shaped how they operated all combined to create a sound signature that echoed through the jungle. And then there were the Australians. The Australians arrived in Vietnam with a different tradition. Where American military culture was shaped by industrial-scale warfare in Europe and the Pacific, Australian military culture was shaped by something older and closer to home: bushcraft, tracking, and small unit operations. The Australian experience of war, from Gallipoli to North Africa to the jungles of Papua New Guinea, had taught them that small, quiet, professional units could punch far above their weight. In Vietnam, the Australian task force operated primarily in Phuoc Tuy province, a stretch of jungle and rubber plantations east of Saigon. Their area of operations was smaller than the American sectors, but no less dangerous. The VC and NVA were present in strength, and the fighting could be just as brutal. But the Australians patrolled differently. Australian patrols were small. 4 men was common. 6 was standard for many operations. 10 was considered large. The smallest operational unit was often just a pair, a scout, and a coverman. This wasn't just about being quiet, though that was part of it. Small patrols were more flexible, harder to detect, and easier to extract if things went wrong. They could move through terrain that would bog down a larger unit. They could stop, observe, listen, and make decisions without the complexity of managing 30 men. And they were quiet. Silence wasn't just emphasized in Australian patrol doctrine. It was foundational. Before Australian soldiers deployed to Vietnam, they trained in bushcraft and tracking at schools, like the Jungle Training Center in Canningra, Queensland. They learned to move through thick scrub without making a sound. They learned to read signs, broken branches, disturbed ground, the direction of bent grass. They learned to distinguish between natural and unnatural sounds. They learned patience, observation, and the discipline to wait. This training built on something many Australian soldiers already had: experience in the bush. A significant portion of Australian troops came from rural backgrounds. They'd grown up hunting, fishing, walking quietly through eucalyptus forests and dry scrub. They understood instinctively how sound carried, how to place their feet, how to move through vegetation without fighting it. For them, the Vietnamese jungle was just another kind of bush, thicker, wetter, more dangerous, but navigable with the same principles. Australian equipment reflected this priority. Where American gear was designed for durability and mass production, Australian gear was adapted for silence. Canteens were often wrapped in cloth or tape to prevent sloshing and banging. Webbing was secured tightly with tape or cord to eliminate rattling. Metal D-rings and clips were wrapped or replaced. SLR rifles, the Australian main weapon, had their slings taped down and their magazines seated with care to avoid metallic clicks. Even the choice of rifle told a story. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, the Australian version of the FN-FAL, was heavier than the American M16, but it was also more solidly built. It didn't rattle. The working parts moved with a solid, muffled chunk rather than a metallic clatter. Australian soldiers loved the SLR for many reasons, but one of them was that it was a quiet weapon to carry. Boots were another difference. While Americans wore standard-issue jungle boots, many Australian soldiers preferred the Ripple sole boot, a rubber-soled boot that was lighter, more flexible, and quieter on hard ground. The Ripple sole didn't have the reinforced toe or metal shank of the American boot, but it allowed better feel and quieter movement. Some soldiers even modified their boots further, cutting away excess material or changing laces to reduce noise. Australian patrol movement was deliberate, slow, methodical. Where American patrols might cover several kilometers in a morning, Australian patrols might spend hours moving a few hundred meters, stopping frequently to listen, observe, and check their surroundings. This wasn't timidity, it was discipline. The goal wasn't to cover ground. The goal was to find the enemy without being found first. Australian patrols used hand signals almost exclusively. Radio communication was kept to an absolute minimum. And when radios were used, they were whispered into, with handsets muffled against jackets or held close to the ear. There was no casual chatter, no unnecessary talk. Silence was enforced not by fear of punishment, but by shared understanding that everyone's life depended on it. This discipline extended to every aspect of movement. Soldiers learned to control their breathing, to place each foot carefully, to test their weight before committing to a step. They learned to move through wait-a-while vines and bamboo thickets without snapping or rustling. They learned to freeze at the first sign of danger and remain motionless for minutes or even hours. They learned to be patient in a way that industrial-age armies often weren't. The Australians also benefited from operating in a more concentrated area. While American units rotated through different provinces and faced constantly changing terrain and enemy tactics, the Australians stayed in Phuoc Tui. They learned the ground intimately. They learned the trails, the villages, the enemy patterns. They built relationships with local forces. This continuity allowed them to refine their tactics over time, to learn what worked and what didn't, to develop an institutional knowledge that didn't get lost in rotation cycles. All of this, the small patrol sizes, the emphasis on silence, the careful equipment preparation, the cultural background, the deliberate movement, the hand signals, the discipline combined to create something unusual. Australian patrols became, for practical purposes, silent. Not perfectly silent. Not silent in any absolute sense. But silent enough that the VC, listening as carefully as they always did, often didn't hear them until it was too late. And the VC noticed. They noticed in the way that soldiers notice things that affect their survival. Australian patrol zones became dangerous places. The enemy adapted by being more cautious, more alert, more likely to withdraw than engage. The psychological impact of never knowing if Australians were nearby shifted the balance of small unit actions in subtle but significant ways. This wasn't about Australians being better soldiers than Americans in any absolute sense. Both armies produced extraordinary soldiers. Both faced the same enemy, the same jungle, the same war. But the Australians brought a different set of tools, both literal and cultural, and those tools happened to be particularly well suited to the specific challenge of moving silently through hostile jungle. The Americans fought their war. The Australians fought theirs. And in the green hell of the Vietnamese jungle, silence became the Australian signature. To understand why Australians moved quietly in Vietnam, you have to understand something about Australia itself. Australia is a vast, harsh, unforgiving landscape. The interior is desert and scrubland. The coasts have thick bush, eucalyptus forests, rainforest in the north. Even the settled areas, the places where people live, are never far from wild country. Growing up in Australia, even in the 1,940 seconds and 50 seconds, when most Vietnam veterans were children, meant growing up with an awareness of the land. For rural Australians, and many Australian soldiers came from rural areas, this meant practical experience with bushcraft from an early age. They learned to hunt kangaroos, rabbits, feral pigs. They learned to track animals through dry grass and scrub. They learned that noise scared away, game and silence brought you close enough for a shot. They learned to read the land, to understand how sound carried in open country versus thick bush, to move through vegetation without leaving obvious signs. This wasn't formal training. It was just life. It was weekends in the bush with your father or your mates. It was checking rabbit traps before school. It was walking fence lines on a cattle station, learning to spot things that were out of place. It was an accumulated body of practical knowledge about how to exist in wild country that couldn't easily be taught in a classroom. When these men joined the Army and deployed to Vietnam, they didn't have to learn bushcraft from scratch. They already had the foundation. The Army just refined it, adapted it to jungle conditions, and added tactical application. But even urban Australians, those from Sydney or Melbourne, were closer to the bush than their American counterparts. Australia's cities were smaller, less sprawling. Getting out of town and into wild country was easier. The cultural emphasis on outdoor life, on camping and hiking and spending time in the bush, was stronger. There was a national identity built around the idea of being comfortable in harsh country, of being able to handle yourself away from civilization. This cultural background created soldiers who were, on average, more comfortable with silence and natural movement than their American counterparts. It wasn't about intelligence or training quality. It was about starting from a different baseline. There's also something deeper in Australian military culture, a tradition of small unit excellence that goes back to the original Anzacs. At Gallipoli, Australian soldiers earned a reputation as skilled raiders and scouts. In North Africa, Australian units were known for aggressive patrolling and initiative. In Papua New Guinea, fighting the Japanese in terrain as hostile as Vietnam, Australian soldiers perfected the art of jungle warfare through bitter experience. By the time Vietnam came around, this tradition was embedded. Australian soldiers were expected to be resourceful, self-reliant, and tactically proficient at the small unit level. There was less emphasis on mass and more emphasis on skill. Less reliance on overwhelming firepower and more reliance on getting close, hitting hard, and withdrawing cleanly. This cultural approach extended to leadership. Australian infantry sections were led by corporals and sergeants who were experienced, professional soldiers. They weren't 19-year-old conscripts with a few months of training. They were career soldiers who'd spent years mastering their craft. This meant more expertise at the point of contact, better decision-making in the jungle, and a higher standard of noise discipline enforced by leaders who knew what they were doing. There was also a sense of national pride involved. Australians were aware they were operating alongside the Americans, the global superpower. There was a desire to prove that the Australian task force, though small, was professional and effective. This manifested in attention to detail, careful preparation, thorough training, high standards. Silence became part of the Australian brand, a point of distinction. Veterans of Vietnam will tell you they took pride in being quieter than the Americans. Not in a hostile way, there was genuine respect and camaraderie between Australian and American forces, but in the way that professional soldiers take pride in doing their jobs well. Being quiet meant you were switched on. It meant you were professional. It meant you gave a damn about your mates' lives. This combination, the cultural background in bushcraft, the national military tradition of small unit excellence, the professional NCO leadership, the sense of pride and identity created an environment where silence wasn't just a tactic. It was part of who Australian soldiers were in Vietnam. When an Australian patrol slipped into the jungle, they carried with them generations of accumulated knowledge about moving through hostile country. They carried the lessons of Gallipoli and Kokoda. They carried childhood memories of walking quietly through the bush. They carried the expectations of the soldiers beside them and the leaders who'd trained them. And they carried all of it silently. Sound is physics. And in the jungle, physics had consequences. When a patrol moves through dense vegetation, every action creates vibrations. A boot pressing into soft ground, a branch bending under weight, fabric brushing against bark, metal touching metal, breath exhaled too sharply. All of these create pressure waves in the air, sound waves that radiate outward until they're absorbed, reflected, or dissipated. In open terrain, sound dissipates quickly. In the jungle, it behaves differently. The density of vegetation creates acoustic barriers and channels. Sound that would travel in a straight line across open ground instead bounces off tree trunks, reflects off leaves, absorbs into thick undergrowth. Some frequencies are dampened almost immediately. Others carry surprisingly far. Low frequencies, deep thumps, heavy footfalls can travel through the ground itself and be felt as much as heard. High frequencies, metallic clinks, sharp snaps cut through the ambient noise of the jungle and alert the ear because they don't belong. Humidity affects sound propagation. In the thick, wet air of Vietnam, sound travels further than in dry conditions. The moisture in the air carries vibrations more efficiently. This meant that noises which might not matter in a temperate climate became tactically significant in the jungle. The jungle itself has a baseline noise level, the ambient sound of wind through canopy, birds, insects, rain dripping from leaves, bamboo creaking. Human ears, especially trained ones, learn to filter this background noise and focus on anomalies. The VC were masters of this. They could distinguish between natural sounds and unnatural ones. They could hear the difference between wind-moving vegetation and a man-moving vegetation. This is why certain types of noise were more dangerous than others. Metallic sounds were the worst. Metal on metal has a distinctive frequency signature that doesn't exist naturally in the jungle. The click of a rifle safety, the rattle of dog tags, the clink of a carabiner against a belt buckle. These sounds stood out like alarm bells because they were unmistakably man-made and unmistakably military. Regular rhythmic sounds were also dangerous. Footsteps fall in patterns. Gear shifting with movement creates repeated noises. Human breathing, especially when stressed or carrying heavy loads, has a rhythm. The VC learned to recognize these patterns. Random, irregular sounds of branch breaking. A rock dislodging might be an animal or natural event. But rhythmic, repeated sounds meant humans. Weight distribution affected noise generation. A heavily laden soldier trying to move quietly faces a physics problem. The heavier the load, the harder to control balance, the more likely to stumble or shift weight suddenly. Every weight shift is a potential noise event. This is why Australian patrols, carrying less gear, had a mechanical advantage. Less weight meant better balance, better control, quieter movement. Patrol spacing also mattered. When soldiers move too close together, their noise signatures overlap and amplify. When they're properly spaced, each individual makes less noise, and the collective sound spreads out, becoming harder to pinpoint. Australian doctrine emphasized spacing for this reason, not just for security, but for acoustic dispersal. The type of ground underfoot changed everything. Dry leaves and twigs were unavoidable noise generators. Mud was quiet, but sucked at boots, creating sounds when pulling free. Rocky ground amplified footfalls. Grassy areas were quieter but harder to navigate without rustling. Good patrol leaders learned to read the ground and choose paths that offered the best combination of cover and quiet. Even body mechanics affected noise. A soldier moving with tense, jerky movements generates more noise than one moving fluidly. Controlled breathing is quieter than heavy panting. Slow, deliberate movements allow testing each step before committing weight. Fast movements create more disturbance. This is why Australian doctrine emphasized slowness, not because speed doesn't matter, but because silence matters more. The science of noise in the jungle meant that every choice from gear selection to patrol formation to individual movement technique had acoustic consequences. The armies that understood this and built their tactics around it had an advantage. The armies that didn't paid for it in casualties. Australian soldiers became students of jungle acoustics, not through academic study, but through necessity. They learned by doing, by listening, by watching what worked. They learned that you could move quietly if you understood the physics and had the discipline to apply it. And they learned that the VC were listening, always listening. The devil was in the details. Specifically, in the hundreds of small details that made up a soldier's kit. Consider the canteen one of the most basic pieces of equipment. American soldiers carried metal canteens. They were durable, reliable, and could be used to heat water. But metal canteens had two problems. They made noise when they sloshed, and they made noise when they bumped against other gear. The sound of water moving inside a metal container carries surprisingly far in quiet jungle. Australian soldiers dealt with this by wrapping their canteens. Some used cloth, others used strips of inner tube rubber, still others used tape. The wrapping dampened the sloshing sound and prevented metal-on-metal contact with other gear. It was a small thing, barely worth mentioning in official reports, but it made a difference. Some Australians preferred plastic canteens when they could get them. Plastic didn't ring like metal. It was lighter. It still sloshed, but the sound was duller, less carrying. Webbing systems were another critical difference. American Alice gear, all-purpose lightweight individual carrying equipment, used metal clips, D-rings, and snaps. These were practical for quick adjustment and heavy loads. But they were noisy. Soldiers tried to tape them or wrap them. But over time, tape came loose, especially in the humidity and constant rain. Australian webbing. Many soldiers still used the older 1944. Pattern gear or variations of it could be configured to minimize metal. Buckles could be taped. Straps could be secured with cord instead of clips. The entire rig could be cinched down tight, so nothing rattled or shifted. Veterans will tell you they spent hours before patrols going over their webbing, securing every possible noise point, testing movement to hear what rattled. Ammunition storage was similar. American magazine pouches often had metal snaps or buttons. Australian soldiers secured theirs with tape or simply tucked magazines in tightly. The goal was the same. Nothing moves. Nothing clicks. Nothing announces your presence. Rifles themselves had different acoustic signatures. The M16, for all its advantages as a weapon system, had several noise issues. The charging handle rattled slightly. The bolt carrier made a distinctive sound when moving. The aluminum magazine, when bumped against something, had a particular ring to it. None of this mattered in a firefight, but on silent patrol, it could matter enormously. The SLR was quieter to carry. Its heavier construction meant less rattle. The wooden furniture didn't ping like aluminum. The magazines were steel, which didn't ring as distinctly as aluminum. Australian soldiers still taped their SLRs, wrapping slings, securing the carrying handle, sometimes even padding the magazine well, but the basic platform was more acoustically neutral. Boots were perhaps the most significant gear difference. American jungle boots were engineered for durability, ankle support, and drainage. They had reinforced toes, steel shanks, and relatively stiff soles. They were excellent boots for their intended purpose. But on hard ground or on exposed roots, they made a distinct sound, a solid thump with each step. Australian ripple-sole boots had thinner, more flexible rubber soles with a ripple pattern that provided good grip. They were lighter and allowed better ground feel. Soldiers could place their feet more carefully because they could feel what they were stepping on. The softer sole meant quieter footfalls on hard surfaces. The trade-off was less durability and less ankle support. But for the way Australians patrolled slowly, carefully, the trade-off was worth it. Some soldiers went further and modified their boots, cutting away excess leather, replacing laces with cord, even padding the heels with cloth to deaden the sound of footfalls. These were personal modifications, done by individual soldiers trying to gain every possible advantage. Ration packaging was another noise source. American sea rations came in metal cans. Opening them required a P-38 can opener quiet enough, but carrying them meant metal cans in a pack, clanking against each other with every step. Australian rations, while not perfect, used more cardboard and paper packaging. When soldiers stripped down for patrol, they often repacked rations into cloth bags or sandbags, eliminating the metal entirely. Even personal items mattered. Dog tags were worn by all soldiers for identification purposes, but they were metal discs on a metal chain, a jingling hazard. Both American and Australian soldiers dealt with this by taping their tags together or sliding them into cloth pouches. Some wrapped them in rubber bands. Some tucked them inside their shirt and taped them down. Anything to prevent that distinctive metallic jingle. Watches, compasses, and other small items presented similar challenges. The solution was always the same. Wrap it, tape it, secure it, eliminate every possible noise source. This obsessive attention to gear preparation took time. Before a patrol, Australian soldiers might spend an hour or more going over their kit piece by piece, testing for noise, jumping up and down, shaking the pack, moving through mock jungle terrain, listening for any click, rattle, or scrape, fixing what they heard, then testing again. It was tedious work, but it was the work that kept you alive. American soldiers did this too, especially in units with experienced leadership. But the institutional emphasis was different. American doctrine focused more on firepower and mobility than silence. Gear was designed for different priorities, and the result was that even well-prepared American soldiers often carried noisier loads than their Australian counterparts. The cumulative effect of all these small differences, canteens, webbing, ammo pouches, rifles, boots, rations, personal items, was significant. An Australian soldier on patrol carried essentially the same types of things as an American soldier, but the way those things were configured, wrapped, secured, and carried created a different acoustic signature. In the silence of the jungle, where a single metallic click could trigger an ambush, those differences mattered. Before Australian soldiers deployed to Vietnam, they went through the Jungle Training Center at Canungra, Queensland. Canungra was where theory met practice, where the lessons of previous wars were passed down, and where the art of moving silently through hostile jungle was taught by men who'd done it before. The training was intense, not because it was physically brutal, though it was, but because it demanded a level of discipline and awareness that most soldiers had never encountered. You learned to do everything slowly. You learned to observe. You learned to listen, not just with your ears, but with your entire body, feeling for the presence of danger. Trekking was a core skill. Instructors would take soldiers into the bush and show them how to read signs. A bent blade of grass, disturbed ground, the direction of a broken branch, the age of footprints based on how moisture had affected the edges. These weren't abstract skills, they were directly applicable to combat. If you could track, you could follow enemy movements. And if you understood how you left signs, you understood how to avoid leaving them. Students learn to move through thick vegetation by working with it, not fighting it. You don't push through wait-a-while vines. You carefully unhook them and slide past. You don't snap branches, you bend them slowly or go around. You don't crash through bamboo thickets, you find a path or create one silently, stem by stem. Observation training was rigorous. Soldiers learned to scan properly, to use peripheral vision, to spot movement and anomalies. But they also learned stillness, how to remain motionless for extended periods, how to control breathing, how to ignore discomfort. Because in the jungle, the first person to move is often the first person to die. Silent signals replaced verbal communication. Every soldier learned a complete vocabulary of hand signals for common tactical situations. Enemy sighted. Stop. Move forward. Danger area. Fire mission. Helicopter. Each signal was practiced until it became automatic. On patrol, you communicated entirely by hand, and you learned to read signals from soldiers who might be partially obscured by vegetation. Breath control was taught explicitly. When you're moving slowly through thick jungle, breathing through your mouth, trying to stay quiet, you have to control your respiration. Sharp breaths carry. Panting from exertion carries. Soldiers learn to breathe slowly, deeply, through the nose, when possible, to minimize audible breathing sounds. Patrol formations were practiced endlessly. The spacing between men, the fields of observation each was responsible for, the rotation of point position so no one burned out, the immediate action, drills for contact. All of it rehearsed until it was instinctive.